The late morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting soft patterns on the countertops and floor. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. I stood at the sink, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water, scrubbing a plate I'd just used for breakfast. It was a task I'd been repeating for days now, ever since the dishwasher gave out and left me with another chore to manage. It wasn't just the inconvenience of washing dishes by hand. It was what it represented. Greg was away as usual, another business trip to another city, doing work that had become the center of his life. In the early years of our marriage, I would have been proud, eager even, to support his ambitions. But now, each trip he took felt like another wall going up between us, another step away from the life we had once envisioned together. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. It used to be full of laughter and warmth, but lately it felt like a shell of what it had once been. I glanced over at the pile of dishes waiting to be cleaned, my reflection distorted in the greasy sheen of a pot. As I rinsed the plate, my thoughts wandered to how everything had started to unravel. The late nights, the missed anniversaries, the countless business dinners where I was just an afterthought. When was the last time we'd even had a real conversation? One that didn't revolve around schedules, bills, or superficial updates. I set the plate on the drying rack and wiped my hands on a towel. My gaze fell on the dishwasher, its silence mocking me. That silence had become a constant in my life, not just from the broken appliance, but from the absence of real connection. The shrill ring of my phone startled me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it from the counter, glancing at the screen. It was the appliance repair company. "Mrs. Carter, this is Jenny from Reliable Appliance Repairs. I'm just calling to confirm that our technician is on his way. He should be there within the hour." "Thank you," I said, my voice polite but flat. "Not a problem. Have a great day." I hung up and sighed, staring at the phone in my hand. Another stranger coming into my home to fix something that I should have been able to rely on. At precisely 11:30, the doorbell rang. I hesitated for a moment, brushing invisible lint off my shirt before heading to the door. When I opened it, I was met with a man who looked to be in his early 40s, standing on the porch with a toolbox in hand. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture relaxed but professional. His face was kind, framed by a neatly trimmed beard, and his smile was warm without being overbearing. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked, his voice smooth and deep. "Yes, that's me," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "I'm here to take a look at the dishwasher." I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip. "Thank you for coming. The kitchen's this way." As I led him through the house, I couldn't help but notice how easily he carried himself, like someone who was entirely comfortable in his own skin. His jeans were slightly worn, his boots scuffed, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he moved. He knelt in front of the dishwasher, setting his toolbox on the floor and pulling out a flashlight. "So, what seems to be the issue?" "It's leaking, for one," I said, standing a few feet away with my arms crossed. "And it's not draining properly. It just stopped working altogether." He nodded, already examining the machine. "Sounds like a faulty seal or maybe a clog. Shouldn't be too hard to fix." His calm, assured tone was oddly comforting. For the first time in what felt like ages, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Daniel worked quietly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. I hovered nearby, unsure of what to do with myself. "Do you mind handing me that wrench?" he asked, nodding toward his toolbox. I picked up the tool and handed it to him, our fingers brushing for a brief moment. It was an innocent touch, completely unintentional, but it sent a strange spark through me. I quickly pulled my hand back, hoping he hadn't noticed. "Thanks," he said, his focus already back on the dishwasher. I turned away, busying myself with tidying up the counter. The house was already spotless, but the act of cleaning gave me something to do, something to distract me from the odd flutter in my chest. As the minutes stretched on, the silence grew heavier. I felt the need to fill it, to say something. "Have you been doing this for long?" I asked, glancing over at him. "About 15 years, he replied without looking up. "I started out helping my dad with his repair business and just kind of stuck with it." "What about you? What do you do?" I don't work," I admitted, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I used to, but my husband's job keeps us moving around a lot, so it was easier to stay home." He nodded, not pressing further. Still, his question lingered in the air, making me acutely aware of how little I felt I had to show for myself. As he worked, the conversation drifted into easier territory. He told me about his favorite repair jobs, the strange things people sometimes tried to fix themselves before calling a professional. I laughed at his stories, the sound surprising me. When was the last time I had laughed like that? "You've got a good sense of humor," he said, glancing up at me. "Thanks," I said, feeling a blush creep into my cheeks. The atmosphere had shifted subtly, the tension easing into something warmer. I found myself relaxing in his presence, the weight of the empty house momentarily forgotten. When Daniel finally stood, wiping his hands on a rag, he gave me a satisfied smile. "All done," he said. "The seal was completely shot, but I replaced it, ran a quick cycle to make sure everything's working, and you should be good to go." "That's great," I said, genuinely relieved. "Thank you so much." "It's what I'm here for," he replied. I walked him to the door, already thinking about how I'd spent the rest of the day. But as he stepped outside, he paused, turning back to me. "If you ever need anything else fixed, don't hesitate to call," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes slinking on mine just a fraction too long. "I will," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I watched as he walked down the path to his truck, his figure silhouetted against the midday sun. There was a strange hollowness in my chest, a feeling I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just relief at having the dishwasher fixed. It was something deeper, something that left me unsettled. I closed the door and leaned against it, staring at the repaired machine as if it held the answer to the questions swirling in my mind. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel the same. The next day felt heavier somehow. Though the dishwasher was fixed and my daily routine had resumed its usual rhythm, my mind kept returning to Daniel. I couldn't explain why. He was just a repairman after all. Yet, something about his presence lingered, like the scent of his cologne that had faintly filled the kitchen after he left. Greg had called late last night, his voice distant, distracted. It was the same conversation we always had during his trips. How was the house? Was everything running smoothly? Did I need anything? And always his promise to be back soon, though soon rarely meant what it implied. I spent most of the morning cleaning, not because it needed to be done, but because it gave me something to focus on. Yet, as I folded laundry and scrubbed countertops, I couldn't help but replay the moments from the previous day. Daniel's easy smile, the way he moved with such quiet confidence, the fleeting touch of his hand when I passed him that wrench. I shook my head, scolding myself. It was ridiculous to dwell on it. He was just doing his job, and I was a married woman. Around noon, the phone rang. I picked it up, absent-mindedly, expecting it to be Greg. Hello? Mrs. Carter, it's Daniel from Reliable Appliance Repairs. I straightened up, caught off guard. Oh, hi. Is everything okay? I was just reviewing the paperwork from yesterday and realized I forgot to mention something. That seal I replaced, it should hold fine, but I'd recommend a follow-up inspection in a couple of weeks, just to be sure. No charge, of course. It's standard practice for parts like these. Oh, I said, hesitating. That's, considerate of you. When would you be able to come by? Does this afternoon work? I'm in the area for another job, so it'd be easy to swing by. I glanced at the clock. What harm could it do? Sure, that works. Great, I'll see you around 3. I hung up, my heart inexplicably racing. It was just a follow-up inspection, nothing more. When the doorbell rang at precisely 3, I felt an odd mixture of nervousness and anticipation. I opened the door to find Daniel standing there, his toolbox in hand, and the same easy smile on his face. Afternoon, he said, stepping inside. Hi, again, I said, trying to sound casual. He followed me to the kitchen, and as he knelt in front of the dishwasher, I couldn't help but watch him. There was a quiet grace to the way he worked, his movements efficient and purposeful. It looks like everything's holding up well, he said after a few minutes. No leaks, no unusual wear, but I tightened the connections just to be safe. Thanks, I said, leaning against the counter. I appreciate you taking the time to check. It's no trouble, he said, standing and wiping his hands on a rag. Better safe than sorry. He glanced at the clock on the wall. I've got a little time before my next appointment. Mind if I grab a glass of water? Of course, I said, reaching for a glass. As I filled it from the tap, I felt his gaze on me, warm and steady. Thanks, he said, taking the glass from me. Our fingers brushed again, and this time, the spark was unmistakable. We ended up talking, the conversation flowing more naturally than I expected. He told me about his family, how his dad had started the repair business, how he'd grown up watching him fix everything, from toasters to air conditioners. I found myself laughing at his stories, his easy humor and unpretentious manner making me feel lighter than I had in years. What about you? He asked, leaning against the counter. What keeps you busy round here? I hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. Not much, honestly. I used to work, but my husband's job keeps us moving, so it's been easier to stay home. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. That sounds isolating. It can be, I admitted, surprised at my own candor. Greg's gone a lot, and this neighborhood isn't exactly buzzing with activity. There was a moment of silence, heavy but not uncomfortable. He seemed to understand in a way I hadn't expected, his empathy both comforting and unsettling. As the afternoon stretched on, the line between repairman and guest blurred. I offered him coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, our conversation dipping into deeper waters. Marriage is tricky, isn't it? He said at one point, his tone gentle but probing. I looked down at my cup, tracing the rim with my finger. It is. I didn't think it would be, but things change. People change, he said quietly. I glanced up at him, his gaze steady and unguarded. For a moment, it felt like he could see straight through me, past the facade I'd been holding up for years. "You seem like someone who deserves to be seen," he said softly, his words landing with a weight I wasn't prepared for. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The vulnerability in his voice matched the ache I'd been carrying, an ache I hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. As he prepared to leave, the mood shifted. The easy warmth of our conversation gave way to something heavier, more charged. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, his hand brushing mine as he handed me the empty cup. "Any time," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He lingered in the doorway, his eyes meeting mine, with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "If you ever need anything else fixed," he began, letting the sentence hang in the air. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. As I watched him walk down the path to his truck, a swirl of emotions threatened to overwhelm me. Guilt, curiosity, longing, all of it crashing together in a way that left me breathless. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart racing. This wasn't just about the dishwasher anymore. It was about something far deeper, something I wasn't ready to confront. The day after Daniel's second visit, I woke up early, the morning light piercing through the cracks in the blinds. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling as I tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. His words from the day before echoed in my mind. "You seem like someone who deserves to be seen." No one had spoken to me like that in years. Greg used to say things like that when we were first together. He'd look at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, like everything about me fascinated him. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, when he looked at me, it was like he was staring through a fog, barely seeing me at all. I turned over, trying to push the thought from my mind. I didn't want to think about Daniel. I didn't want to acknowledge the strange pull I felt toward him. But no matter how hard I tried, he lingered in my mind like a song I couldn't shake. By late morning, I'd given up on distracting myself. I'd tried cleaning, organizing, even flipping through an old photo album, but none of it worked. My thoughts always drifted back to him, to the way his voice sounded, the way his presence filled the room. It was absurd. I didn't even know him. He was a stranger who'd come to fix my dishwasher, nothing more. And yet the memory of his lingering gaze, his careful attention to my words, made my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't felt in years. As I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker, my phone buzzed on the counter. I grabbed it instinctively, my heart leaping when I saw the name on the screen. Daniel. Why is he calling? I hesitated for a moment before answering, my voice trembling slightly. "Hello?" "Hi, Mrs. Carter. I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said, his tone as calm and reassuring as ever. "No, not at all," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "I just wanted to follow up one last time about the dishwasher," he said. "Make sure everything's still working properly." I glanced over at the machine, its smooth surface gleaming in the sunlight. "It's working perfectly. No issues." "That's good to hear," he said, a pause lingering between his words. "If anything changes, just let me know." "Of course," I said, feeling the weight of unspoken words pressing between us. "Take care, Mrs. Carter," he said finally, his voice softer now. "You too," I replied, before the line went dead. I set the phone down, my heart racing. There was nothing unusual about the call, just professional checking in with a client, but it didn't feel that way. By mid-afternoon, I was restless. I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The streets of my neighborhood were quiet, as they always were. the houses neatly lined up like dolls in a row. As I turned onto the main road, I spotted a familiar figure walking toward me. My breath caught in my throat. It was Daniel. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his toolbox absent. He looked different out of his work uniform, more casual, more approachable. "Mrs. Carter," he said when he noticed me, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Daniel," I said, my voice a little too eager. "What are you doing here?" "Finishing a job a few streets over," he said, motioning in the direction he'd come from. "Thought I'd take a walk before heading to my next appointment." "Oh," I said, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Well, it's a nice day for a walk." "It is," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "Mind if I join you?" I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Sure." We walked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of our footsteps blending with the rustling of leaves. I couldn't remember the last time I'd gone for a walk with someone like this, without any agenda or destination. "This neighborhood is peaceful," he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "Too peaceful sometimes," I admitted. "It can feel a little isolating." "I can see that," he said, glancing at me. "It must be hard with your husband gone so often." I looked away, the truth of his words hitting too close to home. "It is," I said softly. "You deserve more than that," he said, his tone gentle but firm. I stopped walking, turning to face him. "Why do you keep saying things like that?" "'Cause it's true," he said simply. His eyes were steady, his gaze unflinching. For a moment, I felt completely exposed, as though he could see every doubt, every longing I'd kept hidden. "Daniel, I began, but the words caught in my throat. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back slightly. "I didn't mean to overstep." "No, it's not that," I said quickly. "It's just complicated." He nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it." We stood there for a moment, the space between us heavy with unspoken feelings. "I should probably get back to work," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Right," I said, stepping aside to let him pass. As he walked away, I felt an ache in my chest, a pull I couldn't explain. I wanted to call out to him, to ask him to stay, but I stayed silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the walk, the conversation, the look in his eyes. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something undeniable between us, something I hadn't felt in years. It scared me, but it also thrilled me. When Greg called, I almost didn't answer, but guilt gnawed at me, so I picked up, forcing myself to sound cheerful. "How's everything?" he asked, his voice distant as always. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll be home in a few days," he said, as though that would make up for the months of absence. "Okay," I said, biting back the urge to say more. The call ended, and I stared at the phone in my hand, my chest tight. The next morning, I found myself standing by the window staring out at the street. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt restless, like something was about to happen. When the doorbell rang, my heart leapt. I walked to the door, my pulse racing as I opened it. It was Daniel. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice steady but his eyes uncertain. I needed to see you." I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. The air between us was electric, charged with everything we weren't saying. I know this isn't appropriate, he said, his voice trembling slightly, but I can't stop thinking about you. Daniel, I began, but he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth, but no words came. He took another step closer, his eyes searching mine. Tell me this isn't real. I couldn't. The space between us disappeared, and before I could think, his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as though testing the boundaries of what was allowed, but then it deepened, the weight of our unspoken desires breaking through the walls we'd both tried to maintain. When we finally pulled away, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. I should go, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. As he walked out the door, I felt a mix of emotions: guilt, exhilaration, and an ache that refused to fade. The line had been crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The hours following Daniel's departure dragged on endlessly. I wandered through the house, touching surfaces that didn't need cleaning, rearranging items on shelves, anything to distract from the memories of his touch, his kiss, the way his gaze seemed to linger, as though he could see everything I'd been hiding. But none of it worked. His presence lingered like a storm cloud, a reminder of what I'd allowed to happen. And what I wanted to happen again. By evening, the tension in my chest became unbearable. Every moment alone with my thoughts felt like another step closer to some inevitable breaking point. I stared at my phone on the counter, my hand hovering above it. I shouldn't call him. I knew I shouldn't. And yet, before I could talk myself out of it, I snatched up the phone and opened our text thread. My message from earlier, "We need to talk," stared back at me like a taunt. His reply, "When?" felt like an open door I'd been too scared to walk through. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was restless. "Can you come by tonight?" I typed, my fingers trembling as I hit send. It didn't take long for his response to appear. "I'll be there in an hour." The hours stretched on endlessly. I changed clothes twice, settling on a soft sweater and fitted jeans, casual enough to not look like I was trying too hard, but flattering enough to feel confident. I kept glancing at the clock, every minute feeling like an eternity. When the doorbell rang, my pulse spiked so sharply it felt as though my heart was trying to escape my chest. I opened the door to find Daniel standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression somewhere between nervous and determined. He wasn't wearing his usual work uniform, just a dark blue button-down and jeans that fit him just a little too well. "Hi," I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. He replied, his voice low and steady. He stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the quiet space of the house. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment as I tried to collect myself. We moved to the living room, the air between us heavy with unspoken tension. I gestured for him to sit, and he did, perching on the edge of the couch like he wasn't sure if he should get comfortable. I sat opposite him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence stretched thick and palpable until Daniel finally broke it. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "If I crossed a line—" "You didn't," I interrupted, my words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It wasn't just you." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Then why did you ask me to come tonight?" I hesitated, unsure of how to put the chaos in my head into words. Because I can't stop thinking about you, I admitted finally, the confession leaving me breathless. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. You're not the only one. We talked for what felt like hours. At first, the conversation was cautious, careful, as though we were both testing the boundaries of what could or couldn't be said. But as the minutes passed, the walls between us began to crumble. I told him about Greg, about how distant our marriage had become, how I felt like I was invisible in my own home. Daniel listened, his gaze never wavering, his presence steady and grounding. When I finally stopped talking, he reached across the small space between us, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a shockwave through me that I couldn't ignore. I don't want to make things worse for you, he said, his voice low, but I can't pretend. I don't feel this. I don't want to pretend either, I whispered, my voice trembling. His hand moved to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin as he leaned closer. If you want me to leave, tell me now, he said, his breath warm against my lips. But if you don't, I didn't let him finish. Instead, I closed the gap between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. It was like a dam breaking, all the emotions I'd been holding back crashing over me in a flood of sensation. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, his touch igniting something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. We moved as though guided by some unspoken understanding, the tension between us finally finding release. He pulled me onto his lap, his hands tracing the curve of my back as I buried my fingers in his hair. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the heat of his touch, the sound of our breaths mingling in the quiet of the room. For a brief moment, guilt flickered at the edges of my consciousness, a reminder of the line I was crossing, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming need to feel, to be seen, to be wanted, to be alive. His lips moved from mine, trailing down my neck in a way that sent shivers racing down my spine. My hands tightened around him, pulling him closer as we sank deeper into the couch, the weight of his body grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the room filled with the soft sound of our breathing. His arm was draped around me, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my shoulder as I rested my head against his chest. The reality of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in yet, and for now, I was content to let it stay that way. I don't know what happens next, I said finally, breaking the silence. Neither do I, he admitted, his voice soft, but I know I don't regret this. His words sent a wave of relief through me, but they also brought a fresh wave of guilt. I didn't know how I was going to face Greg when he came home, how I was going to pretend that nothing had changed. But when Daniel tilted my chin up to look at me, his gaze steady and filled with a quiet intensity, all my doubts seemed to melt away. You deserve to be happy, he said simply. For the first time in years, I believed it. He left an hour later, his departure marked by a lingering kiss that left me breathless. As I closed the door behind him, the silence of the house felt different. It wasn't the oppressive loneliness I had grown used to. Instead, it was a quiet filled with possibility, with the promise of something more. But as the hours ticked by, the weight of what I'd done began to settle in. When Greg called that night, I forced myself to answer, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. Hey, he said, his tone as casual as ever. "How was your day?" "Fine," I lied, the word leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. "I'll be home tomorrow night," he said. "Can't wait to see you." "Me too," I replied, the words barely audible. As the call ended, I stared at the phone in my hand, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I didn't know how I was going to face him, didn't know if I could look him in the eye and pretend everything was the same. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, I awoke to a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. The sunlight filtering through the blinds felt harsh, its warmth intrusive against the cold reality of what I'd done. My thoughts were a tangled mess as I sat up in bed, staring blankly at the wall. Greg was coming home tonight, and I wasn't ready. The day ahead loomed like an impossible task. I forced myself to get out of bed, going through the motions of my usual morning routine. Coffee, breakfast, cleaning. Everything felt hollow, like I was moving through a world that no longer fit me. Every so often, my gaze would drift to the couch, the scene of my betrayal, and I'd feel my stomach twist with guilt. By mid-morning, I found myself checking my phone, half hoping for a message from Daniel, half dreading it. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening. A void filled only with the sound of my own spiraling thoughts. I wondered what he was thinking, if he felt the same mix of longing and regret that I did. Part of me wanted to reach out, but another part of me knew it was better to leave things as they were. By afternoon, I couldn't take the oppressive stillness any longer. I grabbed my purse and keys, deciding to go for a drive. The streets of our neighborhood were quiet, the kind of serene suburbia that had once felt like a dream, but now felt suffocating. I turned onto the main road, letting the car carry me away from the house and all its memories. I didn't have a destination in mind, but somehow I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a small park on the edge of town. The sight of the walking trail, lined with trees just beginning to show the colors of autumn, offered a momentary reprieve from the chaos in my mind. I got out of the car and started walking, the crisp air filling my lungs and grounding me, if only for a moment. I hadn't gone far when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mrs. Carter." I froze, my heart lurching in my chest. Turning slowly, I saw Daniel standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. His expression was hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should have approached me. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely audible. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, taking a cautious step closer. "Neither did I admitted, my pulse quickening. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice low. "About what happened." "So have I said, my words trembling under the weight of my emotions. "I don't know what to do, Daniel. I don't know how to make sense of any of this." He nodded, his gaze steady. "Neither do I. But I can't pretend it didn't mean something." "It did," I said, my voice breaking. "It meant everything." The words hung between us, heavy and raw. For the first time, I felt the full gravity of what we had done, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it. We found a bench along the trail and sat down, the quiet of the park offering a sense of privacy. Daniel turned to me, his expression serious. "Do you still love him?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. I hesitated, the question cutting through me like a blade. I don't know, I admitted. I care about him, but it hasn't felt like love in a long time. Daniel nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. I don't want to come between you two. That's not who I am. You didn't, I said quickly. Whatever's broken between Greg and me, it happened long before you came into the picture. His eyes met mine, a flicker of hope mingling with the sadness in his gaze. Then what do you want? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted to feel alive again. I wanted to feel seen. And Daniel was the only one who had made me feel that way in years. I want to figure this out, I said finally, my voice steady. But I can't do that with Greg coming home tonight. I understand, he said, his hand brushing against mine. I don't want to rush you, but I'll be here if you need me. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, we parted ways, the unspoken tension between us still lingering. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the shadows had grown long and the house seemed even emptier than before. Inside, I busied myself with preparations for Greg's return, forcing myself to focus on the mundane tasks of cooking and tidying. But as the hours ticked by, the weight of my guilt grew heavier. I kept glancing at the clock, dreading the moment when Greg would walk through the door. When Greg finally arrived, it was almost 9. I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway, followed by the rhythmic click of his shoes on the pavement. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the counter as the door opened and he stepped inside. Hey, he called out, his voice casual and familiar. Hi, I said, forcing a smile as I walked into the foyer to greet him. He dropped his suitcase by the door and leaned in to kiss my cheek. The gesture was brief, almost perfunctory, and it made my stomach churn. How could he be so oblivious to the storm raging inside me? How was the trip? I asked, trying to sound normal. Exhausting, he said, shrugging off his coat. But productive. How was everything here? Fine, I said, the word feeling hollow. He nodded, not pressing further, and moved into the living room, settling onto the couch like he had done 1,000 times before. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. He looked the same as always, tidy, composed, focused. But something about him felt distant, like he was a stranger in his own home. As the evening wore on, the distance between us became more pronounced. We talked, but the conversation was shallow, filled with surface-level updates and polite questions. Greg didn't seem to notice the strain in my voice, the way I avoided his gaze. Or maybe he did, and he chose not to acknowledge it. By the time we went to bed, the silence between us felt suffocating. Greg fell asleep almost immediately, his steady breathing filling the room. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I thought of Daniel, of the way he had looked at me, the way he had made me feel. And then I thought of Greg, lying beside me, so close and yet so far away. I didn't know how much longer I could keep living like this, torn between two worlds, two versions of myself. But one thing was clear. The cracks in my marriage could no longer be ignored. Something had to give. The fallout of my actions was just beginning, and I had no idea where it would lead. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. The morning after Greg's return, the house felt different. It wasn't the comforting hum of life returning to normal, but a stark, suffocating tension that hung in the air. Greg went about his morning as he always did, reading the news on his tablet, sipping his coffee, barely acknowledging my presence. It wasn't unusual, but now it felt unbearable. I stared at him from across the kitchen, wondering how we'd ended up like this, two strangers occupying the same space. A week ago, I might have shrugged it off as the natural wear of marriage, the inevitable drift of two people caught in their routines. But now, after Daniel, it felt like a glaring spotlight had been cast on every crack, every fissure in the foundation of our relationship. Greg looked up, catching my gaze. "Is something wrong?" The question startled me, his voice tinged with concern, but I quickly shook my head. "No, nothing." He nodded, his attention already shifting back to the glowing screen in front of him. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. The lie had slipped so easily from my lips, but the truth churned in my stomach like a storm. The hours crawled by. Greg spent most of the day in his office, catching up on work, while I wandered through the house, aimless and restless. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. Guilt, longing, confusion, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. By mid-afternoon, I found myself staring at my phone, Daniel's number hovering on the screen. I hadn't heard from him since our meeting at the park, and the silence felt unbearable. My thumb hovered over the call button, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could talk myself out of it, I hit dial. The phone rang twice before his voice came through, low and steady. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his tone careful. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling. "I needed to hear your voice." There was a pause on the other end, a weighty silence filled with everything we weren't saying. "Is everything okay?" he asked finally. "No," I admitted. "I don't know what to do. Greg's home, and everything feels wrong." "Do you want me to come over?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. I hesitated, the temptation pulling at me like a tide, but the thought of Daniel and Greg crossing paths in the house I shared with my husband made my stomach twist. "No," I said quickly. "Not here." "Then tell me where," he said. I thought for a moment, my mind racing. "The coffee shop on Main Street. In an hour." "I'll be there," he said, the certainty in his voice like an anchor in the chaos of my thoughts. The coffee shop was quiet when I arrived, the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of cups filling the air. I chose a table near the back, away from the windows, my hands trembling as I wrapped them around my cup. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, his presence immediately grounding me. He scanned the room until his eyes met mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. He slid into the chair across from me, his gaze steady and reassuring. "I wasn't sure if you'd call," he said. "I wasn't sure if I should," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. "I'm glad you did." We talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily despite the weight of everything between us. I told him about Greg, about the growing distance, the nights spent lying awake wondering if this was all my life would ever be. He listened without judgment, his presence warm and steady, like a lifeline pulling me out of the darkness. When it was his turn to speak, he opened up about his own struggles, about the relationships that had failed because he worked too much, cared too deeply, or simply wasn't enough. "Sometimes I think I'm just meant to be alone," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "You're not," I said firmly, surprising even myself with the conviction in my tone. He smiled faintly, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of hope. "Neither are you." As the hours slipped by, the coffee shop began to empty, the sky outside darkening to a deep blue. We were the last ones left, the quiet hum of the espresso machine the only sound around us. "I don't want this to end," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Then don't let it," he said, his gaze steady. "But Greg." Daniel reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, but I need you to know how I feel. I care about you, more than I ever thought possible, and if there's even a chance for us, I'm willing to fight for it." His words left me breathless, the weight of their sincerity settling over me like a blanket. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, letting the silence speak for itself. When we finally left the coffee shop, the night air was crisp, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves on the trees lining the street. We stood beside my car, the quiet of the empty parking lot wrapping around us like a cocoon. "I should go," I said, though the words felt hollow. "So should I," he said, his gaze lingering on mine, but neither of us moved. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against my cheek as he tilted my face toward him. "If this is the last time I see you, it won't be," I interrupted, my voice firm. His lips found mine, the kiss soft but filled with an intensity that took my breath away. For a moment, the rest of the world melted away, leaving only the two of us under the glow of the streetlights. When I returned home that night, the house was quiet. Greg was already in bed, his soft snores drifting down the hall. I stood in the foyer, my heart heavy as I stared at the closed bedroom door. I didn't know what the future held, whether I could repair the broken pieces of my marriage or if I even wanted to. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice, and that, more than anything, terrified me. The morning after my meeting with Daniel was a blur of emotions. The night before, his words and touch had ignited something inside me, a sense of hope, of possibility. But the reality of my marriage loomed large in the cold light of day. Greg was already awake when I emerged from the bedroom, the smell of coffee wafting through the house. He was seated at the kitchen table, scrolling through emails on his tablet, a familiar crease of concentration on his brow. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely audible. I moved to the counter, pouring myself a cup of coffee and taking a moment to steady myself. My hands trembled slightly, the weight of my secret pressing down on me. Greg glanced at me as I sat down across from him, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" "You've been quiet since I got back." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and returned to his emails. The distance between us felt insurmountable, a chasm I wasn't sure we could ever bridge. Part of me wanted to reach out, to tell him the truth, but another part of me, the part still clinging to the memory of Daniel's touch, couldn't bring myself to do it. The day passed in a haze of small tasks and forced conversation. Greg spent most of the afternoon in his office, the sound of his voice carrying down the hall as he took call after call. I busied myself with cleaning, my thoughts a chaotic tangle of guilt, longing, and confusion. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, but it was never Daniel. By late afternoon, the silence became unbearable. I grabbed my keys and left the house, telling Greg I needed to pick up a few things from the store. He barely looked up from his laptop, offering only a distracted, "Drive safe." As I walked out the door, I drove aimlessly for a while, the quiet hum of the car engine drowning out the noise in my head. The streets of our neighborhood were empty, the neatly trimmed lawns and pristine houses feeling like a facade, a perfect shell hiding the imperfections within. I passed the park where I had met Daniel just days before, the memory of his words and the way he'd looked at me sending a shiver down my spine. Eventually, I found myself parked outside a small cafe on the edge of town. It was quiet, the kind of place where no one would think to look for me. I ordered a coffee and sat near the window, staring out at the street as the minutes ticked by. I didn't know how long I'd been there when my phone buzzed on the table. My heart raced as I saw Daniel's name on the screen. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, but in the end, I typed only one word: "Yes." Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, his presence as grounding as it was unsettling. He slid into the chair across from me, his expression a mixture of relief and worry. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice soft. "I wasn't sure if I should," I admitted, my hands wrapped tightly around my coffee cup. "I understand," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about us." I looked away, the weight of his words settling over me. "This isn't fair to Greg," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm doing, Daniel." "You're trying to figure out what makes you happy," he said gently, "and there's nothing wrong with that." "But there is," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm married. I made promises." "To a man who's been absent for years," Daniel interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "I'm not trying to justify anything, but you deserve more than just existing in someone else's shadow." His words hit me like a tidal wave, the truth in them undeniable. But the guilt remained, a heavy weight I couldn't shake. "I don't know if I can do this," I said, my eyes filling with tears. Daniel reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I just need you to know that I'm here. Whatever you decide, I'm here." We talked for hours, the cafe emptying around us as the sky outside darkened. By the time we left, I felt both lighter and heavier, the conflicting emotions tearing at me from all sides. Daniel walked me to my car, his hand lingering on mine as we said goodbye. "Take care of yourself," she said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "You too," I replied, my heart aching as I watched him walk away. When I returned home, Greg was still in his office, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face as he worked late into the night. He barely looked up when I entered, offering only a distracted "hey" as I passed by. I went to bed alone, the emptiness of the house pressing down on me like a physical weight. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the day in my mind. Daniel's words, his touch, the look in his eyes. It was all so vivid, so consuming. And yet, the image of Greg sitting in his office, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, haunted me just as much. I didn't know how to reconcile the two, how to make sense of the person I had become. All I knew was that something had to change. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Greg moving around the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that things were normal, that everything was as it had been before. But the illusion shattered as soon as I walked into the kitchen and saw him standing there, his back to me as he read something on his phone. "Morning," he said, without turning around. "Morning," I replied, my voice tight. He finally looked up, his brow furrowing as he studied my face. "You look tired. Didn't sleep well?" "No," I admitted, the weight of my secrets pressing down on me. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Greg nodded, his expression softening slightly. "If there's something bothering you, you can talk to me, you know." The words hung in the air, their sincerity cutting through me like a knife. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, about Daniel, about the kiss, about the feelings I couldn't control. But the thought of his reaction, of the hurt and betrayal I would see in his eyes, stopped me. "I know," I said finally, forcing a small smile. "Thanks." Greg returned the smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He went back to his phone, and the silence between us returned, thicker than ever. As the day wore on, the tension between us grew. Greg seemed to sense that something was wrong, but he didn't press the issue, instead retreating to his office once again. I found myself pacing the house, my thoughts racing as I tried to figure out what to do. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to Daniel. "We need to talk." His reply came almost immediately, names the time and place. The message was sent, and I felt a sharp pang of both relief and fear. I had asked Daniel to meet me at the park later that afternoon, the same place we had spoken days ago. The house felt too confined, too heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, and I needed the clarity that fresh air and Daniel seemed to provide. Greg was still in his office, the door closed as usual. I peeked in briefly to let him know I'd be going out for a walk. "Okay," he said distractedly, barely glancing up from his laptop. "Need me to pick up dinner later?" "That would be nice," I replied, my voice tight. I didn't trust myself to say more. The park was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ground. I arrived early, finding a bench tucked beneath a sprawling oak tree. The stillness of the place was comforting, but it did little to quiet the storm raging inside me. I didn't know what I was going to say to Daniel, what resolution I hoped to find in this conversation. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds, two versions of myself. When Daniel arrived, his presence was as steadying as always. He walked toward me with his usual confidence, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. He sat down beside me, leaving a small space between us, and for a moment, we simply sat in silence. "You wanted to talk?" he said finally, his voice low and calm. I nodded, my fingers twisting in my lap. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. "Any of this." He turned to look at me, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just tell me what you're feeling." I let out a shaky breath, my eyes fixed on the ground. "I feel lost. I feel like I've been living someone else's life for years and I didn't even realize it until you came along." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the bench between us. "You don't have to feel guilty for wanting more, you know," he said gently. "You deserve to be happy." His words were like a balm on my raw nerves, but they also reignited the guilt that had been simmering beneath the surface. "But what about Greg?" I asked, my voice breaking, He's not a bad person. He doesn't deserve this. No, he doesn't, Daniel agreed, his tone careful. But neither do you. Staying in a marriage where you're invisible, where you're just going through the motions, that's not fair to either of you. I turned to him, my eyes filling with tears. I don't know if I can walk away. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You are, he said firmly, his hand covering mine. But it's your choice. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. We talked for what felt like hours, the conversation weaving through the complexities of love, loyalty, and the pursuit of happiness. Daniel didn't push me, didn't demand answers or promises. He simply listened, offering his thoughts when I asked, and holding space for me when I needed it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in hues of orange and gold, I felt a small measure of clarity begin to take shape. I need time, I said finally, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. I need to figure out who I am, what I want, before I can make any decisions. Daniel nodded, his expression filled with understanding. Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. His words filled me with both relief and sadness. I knew that no matter what happened, someone would get hurt. Maybe even both of us. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was beginning to take control of my life. When I returned home, the house was quiet. Greg was in the kitchen, setting out takeout containers on the counter. Hey, he said, glancing up as I walked in. I wasn't sure what you were in the mood for, so I just got a mix of things. Thanks, I said, forcing a smile as I set my bag down. We ate in near silence, the only sounds coming from the clink of utensils and the occasional comment about the food. Greg didn't seem to notice the tension in my posture, the way my mind was miles away, or maybe he did, and he just didn't want to acknowledge it. After dinner, he retreated to the living room, flipping on the TV and settling into his usual spot on the couch. I lingered in the kitchen, staring at the empty plates and wondering how much longer I could keep pretending. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Greg finally broke the silence. Is everything okay with you? He asked, his voice cutting through the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. What do you mean? You've seemed off lately, he said, distant, like something's bothering you. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of his words pressing down on me. For a moment, I considered telling him everything. About Daniel, about how I'd been feeling, about the doubts that had consumed me for so long. But I couldn't. The thought of hurting him, of shattering the fragile peace we had built, was too much to bear. I'm fine, I said finally, my voice hollow. Greg was quiet for a long time, and I thought he might press further, but then he sighed, rolling onto his side. Okay, he said softly. Good night. Good night, I whispered, tears slipping silently down my cheeks as I lay awake, staring into the darkness. The days that followed were a blur of routine and avoidance. I kept my conversations with Greg light and superficial, doing everything I could to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But the cracks in our marriage were growing wider, and I could feel the strain in every interaction, every forced smile. I didn't see Daniel during that time, but we exchanged the occasional message, a lifeline that kept me grounded amid the chaos. He never pressured me, never demanded answers. He simply reminded me that he was there, that I wasn't alone. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, Greg walked in and leaned against the counter. Do you ever feel like we've lost something?" he asked, his voice startling me. I turned to look at him, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze distant. "I don't know, it just feels like we're not the same anymore, like we've drifted." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I felt that too," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg nodded, his expression pensive. "Maybe we should talk about it, figure out how to fix it." His words filled me with a mixture of hope and dread. Part of me wanted to believe that we could fix things, that the years of distance and resentment could be erased. But another part of me, the part that had found something real with Daniel, wasn't so sure. That night, as Greg slept beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. I thought about the life we had built together, the dreams we had once shared. I thought about Daniel, about the way he made me feel alive, seen, understood. And I thought about myself, about the woman I had become, the woman I wanted to be. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep living in limbo. It was time to make a choice, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds as I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Greg was still asleep, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of clarity settle over me. I stared at the coffee, the swirl of cream and the dark liquid mirroring the turbulence of my thoughts. I had spent days, weeks, caught between two worlds, one built on familiarity and duty, the other on passion and the possibility of something new. But I knew now that living in limbo was no longer an option. When Greg walked into the kitchen, his hair mussed from sleep, he gave me a tired smile. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, his gaze searching mine. "We need to talk," I said, the words heavy but certain. He nodded, setting his mug down. "I've been feeling it too," he admitted, his voice soft. For the next hour, we talked, truly talked, for the first time in years. I told him about the loneliness, the distance, the things we had both ignored for too long. I didn't tell him about Daniel. That truth was mine alone to carry. When it was over, we both sat in silence, the weight of our words hanging between us. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. "I think we both deserve a chance to be happy," I said finally. Greg nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "Yeah, I think we do." And just like that, the path ahead became clear.